Welcome to Second Story. Today we're joined by a very special guest, Sarah Maxfield. Sarah's an expert in wellness and personal development with 16 years of experience helping people unlock their highest potential. As a certified coach, trainer, and facilitator, Sarah supports clients through one-on-one coaching, group programs, and workshops. With a background in nursing and a deep understanding of functional nutrition, somatics, and behavioral design, she's all about getting to the root of health and peak performance. An international speaker and a passionate advocate for transformative change, Sarah believes that by empowering individuals, we can shift the course of global health and mental well-being. This is Sarah's second story.
Welcome to Second Story, everybody. I'm Josh Cybulski, joined as always by Leckie. Corey, what's happening, bud?
Hey, Josh, what's happening, man?
What's happening? A lot's happening. We have a female on the show this week, and I'm very, very excited to talk to her. We are joined by Sarah Maxfield. Sarah, how are you?
I'm doing great. I am very excited. I think that the pressure and the excitement around being the female, we'll see how that goes. Very happy to be here and chat with both of you. I've listened to many of your episodes, and I'm loving what I hear so far. So let's dive in.
So, Sarah, you and I met at a workshop. And I just want to get this right. So it was called the Heroic Clarity and Confidence Workshop for Leaders. Is that right?
That's pretty good. Yeah, you missed that big word that nobody knows about, that anti-fragile. Heroic, anti-fragile, confidence and clarity, yes, for leaders. But yeah, it was great.
So
yeah, perfect.
It was a really great workshop. I learned lots, and you and I got talking afterwards, and I mentioned this podcast, and you said, you know what? I've got a few second stories for you.
I do.
So
yeah,
here we are.
Yeah.
So second story, we talk to people that have had pivotal changes in their life, something that sent them down a different path. And for you, we'd love to hear, what's your second story?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's hard. Because I think that we have sometimes like a big second story, and then we've got, all these micro, iterations that we go through. And I think that that's the job in life, is to continue to evolve. Usually second stories are, there's a challenge that comes up and maybe wipes you out or breaks you open, so to speak, and then you become a new person. So I've had a few. I jokingly say that I'm on my third story, because the first story is I'm born into this world. Here we are. Let's see how this goes. And I had actually 2 near-death experiences in a span of 10 days. And so now I'm on my third story. So in a way, this is my third story. But one of the biggies, oh gosh, there's been a few. So one of the biggies was, I'll paint a picture for you. How's that? There's film I've seen. Yeah, I love the dramatic intros of the hero's quest, right? So I am 24 years old. I'm 41 now. 24 years old. I'm this young, naive, new mom, going to be a new mom. And I find out that my partner has decided to not carry through in our relationships. I'm 36 weeks pregnant, and I'm just informed this kind of overnight. And so this happens to a lot of people, right? You have something big that happens, whether it's a medical scare or something in a relationship, or you lose somebody or you lose a job, and you get that feeling of the rug gets pulled out from under you, right? And so you're kind of flipped up, upside down, and life is turned around. And so this was one of those moments for me where it was in a moment I thought I was going down one path with this person I was with, and we were having a baby together, and it's well, we're not. So perfect. The very next day, I packed up my suitcase and I walked down the wrong way on a one-way street, which I just I have that visual of me still. And I was that was so perfect. I ended up going and staying with a family member and just rebuilding my life. And so that was quite a while ago, almost 18 years ago. And what was really beautiful about that, and I think that this lends to, that's a little bit about kind of my version, but what's I think universal is that when these things happen and they come into our lives, we get an opportunity to reorient, not just to what's happening around us, but to us internally, and what do we want, right? And so at the time I'm the oldest of 4 kids. I grew up with parents that struggled with mental illness. I was super parentified. So I was very over responsible. I didn't have a lot of like time in my life to figure out and ask those big questions about what direction do I want to go? You know, what do I want from my life? And so this became a challenge, but certainly an opportunity to start asking those questions. And it was the first time in my whole life that I actually ever lived alone. Just for a few weeks as I was prepping for this baby to come and getting ready for whatever this new life was going to be, I had some like stillness and some time to reflect. And that's when I really dove into books and leaders and mentors, because I didn't really see people in my life around me that were like thriving and doing awesome and kicking ass. And because I was searching, as all of us do at some point, books and authors became really like great leaders for me and great guides. And so Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now, and just this idea that our version of our life is actually not the only story, right? That we can question our thoughts, that we can question our the set tracks we find ourselves on. And so that became a very deep dive. And I've really been on that deep dive for quite a while now, but I'll pause there. That was one. Yeah.
We can definitely dig into that. I actually see a bit of an album cover there with you 36 weeks pregnant, walking down a wrong way on a one-way street with your suitcase in tow.
You got it. Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't select that as your path in life. And as all painful things are later on, they become wisdom, hopefully, right? They become opportunities. I love this idea of, I can't remember what they're called. We'll have to look into it later. But it's this idea that, I can't remember what culture it is, but like if something breaks in that culture, like a vase breaks or like a glass breaks or a dish breaks, they actually pull the pieces together and they create this almost like mosaic with it. And so all of the pieces are there, but then they add in this other glue and stuff. And what it ends up doing is creating this new piece of art. And so I think that breakdowns and breakthroughs can be an opportunity to reassemble the parts of yourself that you want to kind of keep, and then also open yourself out to some new expression, some new art in your life. So I'd like to think of it that way. It did not feel that way then. And so, time does heal some wounds. But I really do. And so go back to this idea of anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is this idea that, we understand fragility. We understand being fragile, being weak. We have moments of that. There's no shame in that. We don't really like to hang out in that place. We like to strengthen. We like to feel good and resilient. There's resiliency, which is better, right? And so that's where you've got some inner resources that are there to help you maybe not feel so weak, and you can bolster those up. And then anti-fragility is like the next level of resiliency. And it's like life comes at me as it does in whatever way it does, and the rug gets pulled out. And I actually get better in response versus getting weaker. And so that's like the crux of what anti-fragility is. The heroic workshop that you were at, that's part of like a coaching program that I've done. So coaching is a big part of my work. But that's a huge piece of their philosophy. It's like, we know life is coming. We'd love to think it's not, but like it's coming, it's hard. How can we actually get better in the face of this challenge? So I like to think of it that way.
I have so much I want to dive into. Just on the point of
Perfect.
This just popped into my head with the anti-fragility. Would you make a comparison between that and grit? Like, would grit be something comparable to it?
So grit is like, you need grittiness to have anti-fragility. Grittiness is like, I think of grittiness as perseverance. It's really, really important. So Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit, the book Grit, and she kind of coined the term and did the research around it. What was unique or interesting about her work was that she went to, I think it was West Point, so military academy, like high acclaimed military academy, studied all of the people that did the best. And it wasn't aptitude, it wasn't natural like athletic gifts or intelligence. It was that grittiness. And that was more like the ability to persevere when it got hard. I feel like anti-fragility is a piece of it, but it's like, if grit gets you through, anti-fragility is what you become, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
They work together. Yeah.
Grit's something I've been trying to teach my daughters about, because it is such a huge predictor of success in life. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's something.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing to explain. It's a nice short word for them, but trying to explain
Yeah.
exactly what it is to them is something that my wife and I have been trying to do because yeah, grit can take you a long, long way in life. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to unpack something you said right at the beginning. This is
Sure.
something that Corey and I have actually thought a lot about over the last year and a
Mhm.
bit. But you said
Mm.
when you were 36 weeks pregnant, you had never really thought about what you want. And Corey and I
Mhm.
actually, when we started the journey that we're on now, we both
Mhm.
put this expression on our screen, which was, "What exactly do I want?" And it's something that like
Right.
I probably thought about it for like I don't know 3 or 4 months. I don't even know how long you thought about it, Corey. It was quite a while, right?
Still thinking about it.
Mm.
Yeah, still thinking about it. Yeah, I do too sometimes.
It's
Yeah.
an evolving question. It's
How
perfect.
how important do you think that question was for you to answer?
Hmm. Well, here's the thing. I only started to get a sense that the question existed then. I'm only now really starting to tap into like how to answer it. So for me personally, it's been a much larger, longer journey to get back to a place where I had the courage to ask that question and had the capacity to lean into like what the answers are. Because we are conditioned to attach to our people when we're little, like when we're little babies. The idea of us being our authentic selves and asking what we want, we're actually really good at it for a while, right? Baby cries, baby's wet, whatever, and they'll cry out, they're hungry, they cry out. But somewhere along the lines, not too far after they're little babies, they start to like shut that down. And they shut it down because it's inconvenient for the people around them, and it's inconvenient for the people around them for all sorts of multitudes of reasons. But we will bypass authenticity, being who we want, what we want in the moment, for attachment, because we must to survive. And the problem is that some of us have done that so long that we get to this, a crisis point or a middle age or whatever, and we have to actually learn to tap into those answers and to even ask the question.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So that's where we're at, Josh. We're trying to learn at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
learn to be this. You talking about like authenticity? It's wild how many people are comfortable with being not being themselves because they don't want to like inconvenience somebody else. So we have a lot of people in the
Mm,
world. I know tons of them, and I've been this person who walk
of
around
course.
not actually being themselves because they're so concerned about other people's thoughts
Yeah.
of them or things like that. And
Yeah.
that's a really hard thing to overcome.
It is. Yeah. Well, and then so think of like the deep roots of that attachment piece, and we all are living with those roots, those primitive um kind of tracks in our brain and our nervous system. But then on top of all that, we live in a time where social media and all of the inputs that we have that says you need to be XYZ are now just kind of exaggerating or exploiting that desire to kind of fit in, if you will. So it really is a courageous act to look at your life and say, I'd like to look. I would like something to be different, because our brains and bodies don't like different. They like the same, even if the same is not great. It burns a lot less glucose to just run the same programming every single day. One of the authors and speakers that I really love is Dr. Joe Dispenza. He's a neuroscientist, and he says, by 35 years old, you are pretty much fully on autopilot. And that's a little bit hard to hear. But if you start to look at, your day and your life and your interactions with people, they run a lot of the same algorithms. And so it takes courage to interrupt that program. And so sometimes the program is interrupted from an external event. Perfect. And sometimes it's actually just like an internal dissatisfaction where we go, well, wait a second. Whose life am I living? What's happening? As you get older, your longevity comes into play, your mortality comes into play, which is great. And so then we might start asking that question. Hmm.
There's I've heard a quote before that most men stop living at 25. They just don't die till they're 80. Kind of your point about the study with men at the age of 35. It's so true. I know so many people who 35 and they hit autopilot. It's teach their own, I suppose.
Yeah, and so I think, I have like deep empathy for somebody who's stuck in that groove, and I've been there. We all have those patterns that are running our lives. It gets pretty exciting and challenging when you start to interrupt the pattern, but it's possible. It's very possible. And that's really what I was looking for back when when I dove into Eckhart Tolle and I started looking at coaching and I started looking at nutrition. Like, how does one actually change the programming or change the pattern? How does one come from whatever situation they come in terms of their upbringing and actually rewrite their second story? And so I've looked for teachers and authors and methodologies to understand how one would do that, because that is a pretty noble quest, but it's a very hard quest to do. And it's not something that we're taught. People just kind of, again, fall into the line of whatever their parents thought or their school or whatever it is. You have to be in heroic. We talk about this word called iconoclastic. So it's a person who breaks icons or who looks at culture and says, "Whoa, no." And then there's another quote that I really love too. And see if I can get this right. But it's no measure of health or wealth or thriving to be well adjusted to a sick society. And so what that means is, like, most of us think we're doing okay, but really we're doing okay based on what? Based on where we came from, based on who we're hanging out with, based on the broader public. Well, the broader public is not doing well. We're not doing well.
Oh.
And so really it takes a lot of courage to step back and go, like, what am I? How do I need to shift my life? And then the bigger question is, like, how do I even do it in this society that's wired to kind of keep me in this container of this life that I've been living? Try and start eating healthier. And we all have kids here. We've got kids and business. We're all entrepreneurs and, try to eat healthier and all these things. But there's so many things that need to be scaffolded in there, in terms of your community and your skill sets and awareness to, like, make that work. And then it's still going to be difficult. So you need that grit. You need that anti-fragility. You need to know that it's going to be hard and then be willing to pay the price when it is, I think is another piece. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it is, like, even something like you said, eating healthy, which is so important. It's hard. It's hard to, because that convenience factor, right? It's easier to grab this packaged thing to throw in their lunch than to make something fresh. And yeah, I do agree with you. Like, that's very hard. And to your other point, being a cog or a gear in a machine that's not running properly, is that where you want to be? Or do you want to be creating that new mechanism in the world? So
Yeah. And I mean, like, self-development and even like an entrepreneurial journey or mindset, like, it's not for everybody, and that's okay. So if you're kind of looking at your life and you're like, actually, I'm good being a cog. Like, I'm very happy. It's beautiful, but it's really, can you take a moment in your life to step out of the roles that you think you're supposed to be playing, to look at the script, look at the players, and be the director in your own life versus just like a player or like an actor. Right. Mm-hmm.
you're speaking our language.
Yeah, I like that.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to ask you, so with all of your workshops and your one-on-one goal setting and all the things that you do with people,
Sure.
is there a common obstacle that you see in most people? Like, is there a common thing that they sort of get stuck in?
Okay, so there's probably several. So let's just play with a few and we'll see where we get to. I mean,
Okay.
I think the biggest obstacles we have, okay, so one is the story we've told ourselves about why we can't have the thing we're going after. So the stories we tell ourselves in general is a huge obstacle for people because we believe them. We're not taught to question them. We make moving forward more difficult than the world actually does for us. So we internally battle more than we actually battle externally. And so it's this idea that we kind of create our own cages in our life, not intentionally, unintentionally, but we do. And so you have to kind of know, especially as you're growing. Here's the really crazy thing to me, or the frustrating thing. When you start doing really well, and I've experienced this somewhat recently, you start doing really well, there's a part in your body that's like, whoa, no. And it will, like, pull you back because, again, our nervous systems want what feels safe, and what feels safe is same. And so you start breaking out of those kind of cages or glass containers that you're in, and you better be ready for, like, that internal battle to come up, because it's coming. So I think just the idea that we we have these stories we're telling ourselves is semi-foreign to a lot of people, and that success can actually be more threatening to our sense of self than failure is really hard for people to wrap their heads around.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to experience, even if you have a sense that that's true. It's still like, what? Really? Yes, that's true. So that's hard.
I actually relate to that quite a bit, exactly what you
Okay.
just said. We had a guest on a few episodes ago who was someone that could just, he was okay with just jumping off the mountain, you know, and
Sure, yeah.
and taking it in stride and being successful. I've always had this bit of a self-sabotage issue that as soon as things are going well, I do backpedal, almost like you said, into that safe zone. So I'm curious, like, is there something more to that? Like from a health standpoint, is there something neurological around that or biological?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our nervous systems are well grooved into patterns, right? So that's a piece of it. And again, depending on like kind of typically your early history, but just depending on your history and how your nervous system um, registers energy or stimulation or stress. You know, there is stress, that's a big category, but there's good stress and bad stress, if you will, right? And so you can start feeling a sense of activation or even success, and then the nervous system goes like, whoa, I don't know what this is, this feels different to me and I need it to feel kind of the same. The other piece, unfortunately, that I find is like too often true is that we internally have these set points, but like our communities, so our family systems often, our places of work, the people that we've known us for a long time, they have a set kind of model of who they think we are. And when we start to deviate from that, again, there's this like, "Whoa, what? What are you doing now? You're doing a podcast now? You're doing this business now? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Have you experienced it, right? Like, have you experienced that
Yeah,
a little bit?
of
Yeah.
course. Yeah, for sure.
So and I don't know. I don't actually know. I don't know what the research is on this, but like, I've experienced it personally. I've seen it in a ton of my clients. It it's very, very challenging for people to I think I told the crab bucket story maybe at the heroic workshop. I don't know. But I heard this theory that if you have like a bucket and it's full of crabs and one crab tries to like climb up the edge and get out, right? Then the other crabs will pull it down. And like we do that to each other as people, and it's terrible. But I think that, you know, I've had this sense, you know, that one of the reasons I think that we think we don't want to move forward is because we're afraid of failure. But I've had this other kind of like internal like fear if I'm listening really when I'm quiet. And it's like, what if I try all of the things that I know? Like I've gathered a lot of information about peak performance in human development over the last, 16 years. What if I applied a bunch of that stuff and I still feel like the woman who was 36 pulling her suitcase down the wrong way? Like, so then it's like, ooh, then I know that I'm not good enough if I've done all the things. So it's almost like there's always a protective mechanism to self-sabotage. So that's kind of my own personal little realization that's come up. But having the understanding that like everything we do is for a purpose. So getting curious and self-compassionate about like, what is that? And a little bit of stillness helps, because if we're just on autopilot and like zooming through life from thing to thing to thing, we won't be able to hear or like locate where we are in terms of on the right path for us. It was a bit of a roundabout answer, but how's that land for you?
No, it's good. There's a lot in there that resonates with me personally. I know Corey too. Corey talked about self-sabotage, and it's something that I've dealt with a lot in my own life as well, and sort of feelings of like worthlessness and not being worthy of certain things. I had a moment a few years ago, when you talk about like putting yourself through stress. I had a moment a couple of years ago. I was in the hospital for a very long period of time, and I was in this major distress the whole time, as you could imagine. And when I came out of it, I kept thinking to myself, like my entire life had been these moments where I would get put into distress, but I'd never really put myself into stress. And I kind of call it like, I heard somebody call it distress and eustress. And I remember hearing that and being like, I don't think I've put myself into eustress. And the past couple of years, everything I've tried to do is me putting myself into stress, which I refer to it as eustress. And I
Sure.
found that as I've done that more and more, like the idea of like getting up at 5 a.m. and working out and eating healthier and
Hmm.
being disciplined, these are all versions of me putting myself into stress. But as I've done that, I
Hmm.
found the other parts of my life, I'm not put into distress as much. Um,
Yeah.
when I
Hmm.
started doing that, though, I had this feeling of like, oh, great, now I'm going to feel distress and use stress, and it's going to multiply. And I think that might
Right.
actually be a hindrance for people. They're like, well, I don't want to put myself into stress because life already does it. You think there'd be any truth to that?
Right. I mean, I think it's true that people feel that way for sure. And I think it's true that we are like creatures that do not want to do things that are painful. But here's the thing. This is interesting. So I'm like a podcast crazy person. I'm on podcasts all the times. I read a ton of books. But actually, Andrew Huberman had David Goggins on. I knew we were going to talk about David Goggins. Anyways, David Goggins, we could talk about him for a while. But um, Andrew and David were talking about there's actually a part in our brain that we still haven't like fully discovered. If I say it correctly, it'll be wild, but it was something like the anterior mid cingulate something. But there's like two little pieces in the back of our brain somewhere. And essentially, these are the parts that when weak, we feel a greater sense of distress when life comes at us. And the way to actually physically make those parts of the brain stronger is to stress it. So, cold exposure, exercise, waking up early, doing the things you don't really want to do, creating this sense of discipline and self mastery, as opposed to kind of falling back into whatever your version of a status quo are. You can actually create more activity and strength in that part of the brain. And so I do think that that provides a certain insulation for the stresses that come. um, One of the things that this reminds me of is one of the coaching programs I did was the Heroic Coach program. It was called Optimize back in 2019. I was in their first cohort, and I had come out of another kind of second story, a real deep, um, dysregulated time where I had to like again rebuild up my body. I had a health incident that happened, and then it made me look at life very differently. Anyways, on the other side of that, as I started getting healthier and stronger, I leaned into this heroic coach and optimized coach stuff. Well, part of our graduation or a graduation requirement was to run a Spartan race. So a year before that, I had been having cardiac issues. I found out actually just 2 years ago, I had something like called an arrhythmia, which meant that my heart would, if I was sitting here, my heart could race up to 170 beats per minute. To give people context, a normal adult heart rate is like 60 to 100. We want to stay in the low end. So if it jumps up to 170, you do not feel good and it is not good for your body. So, anyways, this started happening years ago. And then I healed through many different modalities enough that I started weightlifting, I started walking and then running and doing these things and did this coach program. And then they're like, okay, you need to come to California for the graduation and run a Spartan race as part of your graduation. I'd never run a race like that. This is like, for those viewers that don't know, it's like a Tough Mudder. It's Spartans all over the North America and all over the world, but it's an obstacle race and kind of a hiking running race. And so this was a huge feat for me. But the idea in heroic, again, this anti-fragile kind of capacity or mentality is like, we're actually going to go to an obstacle race to pay to kind of suffer, but to be challenged so that we have something to draw upon mentally, emotionally, physiologically to draw upon. As David Goggins would say, like in your cookie jar, we call it a hero bar. But we need to have these moments of mastery. And so we create them in the workout room and we create them when we wake up at 5 a.m. We create them when we jump over that wall or climb up that rope. So then when life comes at you, you go, oh shit, I can do this. I got my butt up a rope at, 38, whatever years old. And I got my butt out of bed when I could have hit the snooze button. And so you have to reconfigure the view of yourself from the inside out. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. By doing those difficult things, though, is one way to do that. And it changes the brain, which is just wild and amazing. And it changes the way you perceive yourself. So again, and I speak about a heroic a lot. It's not kind of the only thing that I do, but I do draw a lot of wisdom from it. And it's not strictly our wisdom. It's, from authors and thinkers from ancient wisdom to modern science. But it's really all about like, how do we close the gap between who could we be and who are we being? Right. And as long as you're making progress with that, then you feel invigorated, you feel alive, you feel energized. When you're moving further away from who you know you can be, and we have this like internal compass. If you're moving further away, that's where anxiety, depression, regret, frustration, anger, where a lot of that can at least be
Shame.
in part shame, can be fueled by that, right? So anyways, I just said a lot, but yeah, I think it's really, really key to get over that first hurdle, to get over that first wall, if you will. In Spartan, I love Spartan as a metaphor for life. And if you haven't run one, they're so fun. They say you'll know at the finish line, right? If you can get to yourself to the starting line, if you can do a little bit of prep work, you're going to do a lot better. You'll feel less, like you got your butt kicked. But if you can just get your name on the line and then get there and start, you will surprise yourself. And this is the thing, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we talk a lot about doing hard things and the results that can come from that. Just recently, Josh, myself, and someone else, we did a 72-hour fast, which it was our first time doing a fast like that. And I'm not going to talk about whether that's medically good or not, or if it's a good choice or whatever. But for us, like it was all about doing that hard thing and seeing if you can. And I actually draw on that now, where I'm like, if something's kind of tough, I'm like, yeah, but I did that 72-hour fast, like, and I got through that. That was pretty crazy.
Nice. Yeah.
I do have a question. You've been talking about heroic. I think we need to do a bit of a explainer of what heroic is. So if you can give us an overview about heroic.
Let's do that. Okay. So Heroic is a public benefit corporation. They're based out of the States, but essentially they take ancient wisdom. So things like, a lot of stoicism is threaded through Heroic, but also modern positive psychology, modern peak performance in terms of nutrition and sleep. And so the founder, Brian Johnson, he had the courage to ask a lot of questions at some point in his life to say like, okay, what do I actually want? And how do I live this great life? And he was also led back to books. And so Heroic is the distillation of now, I think it's probably 800 books. So thought leaders, old, new, and evolving, and all of them kind of funneling information into, we have a coaching program that I've been through. We have a workshop that's like a deep dive into some of the coaching components that we talk about. And then they have an app, and the app is actually pretty awesome. It's a kind of habit behavior modification kind of app. So it was designed by the same people who did all these like really cool apps. So it's sleek, it's awesome, and it gives people a way to kind of like get into the wisdom that we're sharing with people, and then also track like their progress. That's a bit about Heroic. We have people so I was in the first coaching program with them in 2019. We've now trained 10,000 coaches. So there's a huge piece around being the hero in your own story, and then going back into your community and either coaching one-to-one or coaching in groups or the workshop or whatever. But even just being like a model of possibility is really where this is founded. And then so the content, if you will, is how do we do that, right? What's the math, right, to get from here to there? So yeah, it's pretty great. You can check it out, heroic.us. They have a deeply embedded mission, and that's we say we're trying to move towards 51% of the world flourishing by 2051. So huge, bold goal. But can we tip the scales? Because again, we know that our mental health is not great collectively. Our physical health is not great. We pour tons and tons and tons of money into healthcare, and we're not better. So like there's something very broken with this. So can we on an individual scale step into our own power or in authenticity to be a model for what's possible and see that ripple out, is the kind of guiding principle in Heroic. And they feature like amazing authors like David Goggins, which we talked about, and Mark Divine, a lot of stoicism, a lot of military, a lot of also just like doctors and authors and Mel Robbins and all of the people you would find in your like self-development bookstore. So yeah, it's great. And we used to call it, I don't know if this is the actual official tagline anymore, but the founder would say more wisdom in less time, right? And so the idea is like, most people are not going to go out and read 10, 20, 50, 100 self-development books. And so all of the content that we have within Heroic is, it's been read, distilled into either MP3 video or like a PDF. So different ways for people to consume that information, bring it into their life, see how it lands for them, and just like a huge storehouse of wisdom. So it's pretty great. And it's been like a great scaffold for my own journey. And we've got a great community. We've got tens and tens of thousands of people all over the world. So I was just in Greece with a whole bunch of them doing a workshop training in November. We have a pretty kick-ass community. So, and here's the other thing that's really key. And I'll maybe leave it on that for now. When I went to that graduation in 2019 and I ran that first Spartan race, what occurred there that was so transformational in addition to the Spartan race was that for the first time in my whole life, I met a group of people I'd never known before. And I didn't feel like I had to explain why I was going after this big thing in my life, whether that was a physical goal or a goal in work or parenting or whatever, because that community was like, oh yeah, I got that. Like, I know that language. I'm into that. And they had also kind of suffered with feeling a little bit ostracized or alienated in their own small communities. And so this is where I think community, obviously a lot of change is going to happen on the individual level, but community is what is the exponentializer. And so what we've done in terms of building that community all over the world is created a space where people can come and try on kind of different ideas, new ideas about who they can be and what's possible for them in a space where they're not being pulled back down into that bucket, so to speak. And that's pretty powerful. So,
Corey and I literally had that conversation like an hour and a half ago
Okay.
about how it's very hard to find people that are in a similar state of mind to us with that. Like, it's just most people don't really get it. But I want to go back to something you said about it being a model of possibilities in your community, because that is something I feel like Corey and I are becoming that. Like, I don't know about him, but certainly, like, I've had it pointed out to me by several people who, friends, family, stuff like that, that I have a sense of optimism that they don't have, and they do find it to be encouraging, and they like it as a personality trait. And I was never somebody who was overly optimistic about, where the world's going and things like that. I think it's very difficult to be optimistic. Obviously, we're talking about like mental health, physical health, things that people are dealing with. I think it's pretty tough to be optimistic in the world as it currently sits. But I actually feel a lot of optimism, at least for like myself and my family and things like that. But yeah, like, how important is that to have optimists in a community?
I think it's critical. And it doesn't mean that you have to be that person all the time, every moment in your life. Right. But kind of 80-20 rule it, if you will, if you can hold the energy of that and hold a vision. So hope is just like, or optimism, but I'm going to use the word hope for a second. Hope is just the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. Right. And so we might not always have that. One of the drivers of hope we talk about in Heroic is sleep. These like fundamental pieces of our day-to-day life. You get a couple nights of bad sleep. You remember being a new parent, or maybe those that are working shift work. You are not as helpful if you're 7, 10, 20, literally people are going decades, not getting just the basics, right? Like the basic nutrition, the basic movement, the basic sleep. So it makes feeling hopeful and optimistic a lot more challenging and a lot more out of reach. And so I would say good for you. If people are starting to notice, you've definitely been putting in the work for long enough to shift something. And the best way to help people change is to be a model of it. We don't really want to be told what to do. We have this built-in like autonomy. You all know it. I have a 4-year-old. He doesn't want me to tell him what to do. We all have that inner 4-year-old, 3-year-old. It's awesome. We don't want to just roll over and do whatever everybody else says. And so you've got to have that model of what's possible for you. And if it can't be you, to have somebody in your community, in your family, it just kind of, you're like, oh, what's that all about? Like that person, you can feel it energetically. You can feel that there's a difference. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it really is. Hope is a good way of putting it. Hope is, if you lose hope, it makes life really, really difficult, because a lot of times that might be all you have is hope or optimism. That's,
Yeah.
if when you're in a tough situation or you're suffering through something, hope
Yeah.
is really all you have in a lot of cases.
Yeah. And I think we always talk about, so again, pulling from some heroic content here, we talk about a gap. So to have hope, you need to have goals. So gap being goals, agency, so a belief in yourself, and then P, which is pathways. So goals, agencies, pathway. And that's a bit of like a formula if you're thinking about hope, plus sleep. Please also add sleep.
Gaps.
But the idea that gaps, yeah. Well, gaps with an S. Yes, of course.
There you go.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, gaps. One of the gaps that we have with hope is, yes, sleep, but we are teleological. We are goal centered. We are target seeking creatures. We have a part in our brain called the reticular activating system. There is so much information that comes into our senses, visual senses, physical senses, into our minds. And think about how much we're being inundated with new information all the time. That reticular activating system, it's a primal part of your brain, sits at the back of your brainstem. It has to sort through all of these inputs that are coming in. And so you can tell it what it's like Google or AI, if you will. You can tell it what to focus on, right? But it's just going to focus randomly otherwise. And so the great example that's used a lot is like you buy that new red car and then you see the red car all the time, or whatever, that the shoes that your kids want. Or the thing is like those shoes or the car, there's not more of them. You're just more tuned in to the fact that they're out there. You're filtering them out less. Right. So that's the piece around goals. Like we need to have targets. We need to have something to point our energy to, because otherwise we're just dissipated all over the place. Right. And that's not going to work. Agency, we've really also spoke about. You are not going to perform more than your internal sense of self. You're not going to move beyond that. So you have to create a bigger, stronger, more resilient, more anti-fragile sense of self so that you can actually get to that goal. So we've already talked about that. And then pathways is just the idea of, again, kind of anti-fragility, but even growth mindset, grittiness comes back to this too. Pathways are like, I can't just have one plan, or I'm actually not going to have a lot of hope, or I'm not going to be very anti-fragile. Because if that one plan goes wrong, well, then what? So Tony Robbins, one of my first great teachers, Unleash the Power Within. I walked on fire at a conference in 2013. Great experience. He taught me about the RAS system. Yes. Yeah. So fun.
I love Tony Robbins.
Yeah, a lot of jumping, and walking on coals and all the things. But he really speaks to this idea that like you have to tell your brain basically what to look for. So we can do that. And he says if you have one pathway, you have no pathways, because that's the likelihood of that, you running into trouble is pretty high. So when you have multiple pathways, and we know this in business, right? Or in finances, if you have a diverse portfolio, if you have multiple options, then you have things to fall back on, basically. So goals, agency, pathway, that helps with there's hope. The other piece too is like, I'm very cognizant of mental health in terms of like my own experience, other people's experiences. It's not okay to kind of just like gaslight people and say, or yourself. We gaslight ourselves a lot, and we sort of tell ourselves, well, it's no big deal, or we tell somebody else, it's no big deal. Just try harder. Right. I don't like that mentality. And sometimes the grittiness and the like doing hard things, we can get into a little bit of that. So there's a bit of a balance there. But if you're really struggling and you feel hopeless, it's really, really, really important and can't be said more. Like, please reach out to people to at least have like a lens on somebody looking into your life and supporting you, right? Because if you can't have hope for you, you need somebody else who can carry that with you for a little bit. So that's just my little important disclaimer. I love personal development. I love intensity. But there's also like a space of compassion, and reaching out when you need that support is really, really key too.
That one kind of hits home just because I have known a lot of people in the last like year or two who have actually, committed suicide or had drug overdoses. And it really, everybody keeps saying it's becoming an epidemic. And it's, for me, at least the people in my circles, it's long been one for at least a number of years now. So that one certainly hits home. Yeah. I want to go back to agency for a second. So you talked about agency. I'll use the phrase, I don't exactly remember what phrase you used, but I'll use the phrase like limiting beliefs.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So when Corey and I started this podcast, this is something that used to really piss Corey off that I would do. I would make these cracks because it's just in my nature. I would make these cracks about how no one was watching our show because no one was watching our show. Yeah. So it was this constant thing. Like I probably made, I don't know, I might have made the crack for like 3 or 4 months. And at one point, Corey got mad and was like, dude, you got to stop doing that. You're like, I know no one's watching the show, but you don't need to remind everybody that no one's watching the show.
Sure.
So I stopped doing it at that point. I think this was like January of last year. And it's funny because as soon as I stopped doing it, people started actually watching the show. And it was really, it's, you can't really say that there's like a causation or correlation there, but like,
no, sure.
It's just, it was funny how like I was putting that out into the universe. And then as soon as I stopped, things kind of flipped for us. But it was something in our own heads where I was like, oh yeah, we can get people. I started to have a bit more confidence after I stopped saying that like we will find people to watch this. So there definitely is something to agency and like overcoming your own limited beliefs, even if they are a joke. Like there's truth behind every joke.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, agreed. And I think that our words have a lot of power. And so being mindful about what words we're saying out loud and then internally. So again, finding a bit of that stillness to actually hear what kind of nonsense is happening in our everyday thinking, because there's a fair amount of nonsense in there, and being willing to question those. And I love that you have the dynamic in your partnership for the podcast where you can say like, hey man, like, let's not say that, right? Like that feels like limiting. And I think that that's great. And yeah, you know what? It probably is. It's very scientific. I'm sure it's, you stopped and then you just got the viewers. It's perfect. But like, I think there's this idea. One thing that I like in the personal development space, and it's more of just like a growth mindset piece, a slight tweak that's really easy actually to teach kids, because you were speaking about that earlier, Josh. I'm really, really passionate about our little people, because I think a lot of the problems we have as older people stem from when we're little people. I'm not alone in this thought, but it's just this idea of saying, in your example, we don't have a lot of listeners yet, right? And so just creating that, it's like, that's just where we are right now. So there's this piece around like, we kind of want to have enough sense of where we are in our reality. We don't want to be too checked out, but we also don't want to believe that this is the only space we can go. And so you add yet to that as a kind of qualifier, and you give yourself permission to kind of lean into, you know, what is possible or what might be next.
Yeah.
So, and you know, with a kid is like trying out a new skill, they're like, oh, I can't tie my shoes. Okay, cool. But like, yet, like you will be able to, or we'll get Velcro or whatever. Doesn't matter. Right. I think that those moments are really key when you can bring that language in.
The yet thing, I've used that, but I always used it for jokes. I never actually used it in a real thing. So like,
I love that.
My friends always argue. They would argue about like Canada and politics and things like that. And I have a buddy who would always say like, "Oh, we live in a communist country," and I would always make the joke, "Not yet." Like that was always kind of, that sort of thing.
Different way of using it.
Yeah, very different. But
I like you're learning. There's many ways we can go about this.
Yeah, I'll use your way from now on, a much more inspirational way than sort of.
I promise it's not mine, but we'll both borrow it together. How's that?
Sure, that sounds good.
I was just gonna say, I think in a lot of ways we have been adding that too, and probably since we had that conversation, like we were really putting limits on our potential at that time. And we've even had people say, you know, your show looks too good. Like you've got, you know, lights and everything. Maybe you should bring it down a bit to like make it more local. And it's like, no. We want to be bigger. Like we want to look better than this, you know?
Yeah,
so
sure. Yeah. Isn't that interesting though? Like that's the feedback. Could it be smaller, please? That would make me more comfortable.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's common humanity. You're going to encounter that, and beautiful. You're like, great feedback. I will think about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
You know?
So we take all the feedback in, and the crab bucket you push.
Yeah.
They're
pulling us back.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. Cool. What else do you guys want to talk about?
I was kind of curious. So in your roles, with your workshops and your one-on-ones, if someone is kind of stuck, if they're stuck in that mindset, whether it's around like health, career, whatever it is, what's your starting point with them? Or is it different for everybody?
Well, there's a similarity, and then there's something that's unique to them and something that's universal. So universally, I kind of feel like a detective. I actually love the idea that people are these like big puzzles. And so I take a kind of a bird's eye view. So I come from a background of like integrating like health and nutrition and medicine. I graduated from nursing school. I've done a lot of like the coaching stuff, so looking at the behavior. So I take, when I first meet people, like a big kind of step back. One, because any coach, right? Like your coach is on the bench. It's on the sidelines. They're not right up beside you all the time, right? So just some distance so that you can kind of get a sense of what's going on in this person and all of these these interplaying dynamics that are going on. So I'm a detective that way. And what I'm first looking for is like just general energy. Because the thing is that like your energy is driving all of the other things. It's driving your mental health. It's driving your focus. It's driving how you show up at your business. It's driving how you show up in your relationships. We all know as parents that when you have not as much sleep, you may not be as nice that morning if you haven't had your coffee yet or whatever. And it's not because you're a bad person, it's just your energy drops. So the world becomes more challenging, right? And so doing whatever I can within reason alongside my one-to-one client or group coaching to bring that energy up allows us to face problems as we uncover them, which is so much more ease and so much more resiliency. So that's number one. Detective work at like, where's the energy draining from this system? How do we get it back before we dive into problems? That was kind of the universal thing. What is it? That kind of becomes unique too. I think I'm always also thinking about like, to what degree is this person ready to move forward and is coachable? Because that's really big. There's something that I've struggled with for many, many years, and it's based on how I grew up. I talked about having parents that had mental health issues and addiction issues, and I was super parentified. And so I was always trying to do a lot of fixing, right, and performing to like make things better for them so that I could feel safer. And so you always walk a fine line in coaching with like rescuing versus coaching. And so I am a little bit allergic to like dragging people into their own happiness at this stage in my life. I just don't want to do it. It takes so much energy. And so I'm kind of assessing, the whole picture of where people are at, what's their energy like, and also, do they really want this? Because I know how hard it is when you want to change. I've been in this space for a long time and I still wrestle with things, and I have got lots of skills and lots of support, and I've made so many gains. It's still hard. So you got to really want it, and you got to be receptive to some feedback and understand it's going to be uncomfortable. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of my thinking when I'm first interacting with a person.
Yeah. I think it did. You talked about like kind of stepping out, taking that bird's eye view, assessing each individual. I like that you do take that approach where you're almost siphoning out, or you're almost like picking and choosing who is actually coachable, because you're right. There is some people that say, this is what I want, this is what I want, this is what I want, but they're not actually doing anything towards that goal.
And there's reasons to that. And like, I can work with that level of self-sabotage, and I can work with like the incongruency between what they're saying and what they're doing. Like, we all have that.
Sure.
But like, there's a certain level of that like the receptivity of like new information is just not even going to be there. Right. And that's okay. That's not a problem. That's where they are right, at that point, not an issue. I'm really eager to work with people that are really eager to move things forward and know it will be difficult, but are open-minded enough to say like, let's try anyways. And that's what's exciting to me at this stage in the game.
Nice.
I used to think, like maybe 5 years ago, that the whole idea of like somebody wanting change, but like not really wanting change, like saying they want it, but do they really want it? I used to think that was sort of absurd, like probably 5 years ago. But then once I actually started to be that person, I started to realize that it's not fully that they like don't really want the change. It's just that they don't really want the trade-off that comes with the change. Like for me, in this whole thing with changing, like I've realized that there are parts of me that have basically had to die like just go away. And like that part of me can't exist. Like I used to love eating junk food at night, like watching a movie, eating junk food. I realized that like if I want to get healthy and get into better shape, like that part of me's got to go away and never come back. And there are other little pockets of my life where I'm like, I can't be that person or do that thing anymore. And at the time when I felt that way, I didn't really want the change more than I wanted to still have that comfort. And I think that, at least to me, a lot of people I know that say they want change but don't want to actually make the trade-offs for change, that's where they get stuck up, as they're just like, well, I don't want to give up the comfort. Like I'd like the change, but I like the comfort better.
And I think that's honest, at least, right?
Yeah.
Whereas some people are just kind of like, they're still stuck in the like not knowing what they don't know stage. And they just feel like, I don't know, maybe they're not even asking the question. So you said something, Josh, that resonated with me. I'm a little bit older than you, just a tiny bit. And I think it doesn't mean I'm wiser.
You're younger than me, though,
Well,
Sarah.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
So there you go.
Perfect. So the thing that you said was like a part of you had to die. So I want to talk about that for a second, because when people think about, well, actually, this is funny. If people think about dieting, the first 3 words, 3 letters spell die, right?
Yep.
There's a lot of pain associated with what we think getting healthy means, right? And so one, that's going against this whole like we're creatures that are pain avoiding creatures, first of all. So that's a problem. But what I've evolved to embrace is like my current thinking, and my thinking could always change, is not so much that a part of us has to die, but a part of us might have to be like integrated. And so this is actually based off of this idea from Richard Schwartz, who created IFS, or internal family systems. And he's like, sorry to tell all of you, but you all have multiple personality. Call it disordered, call it whatever you want, but we are all multiples. So that's like one piece that he teaches people to kind of digest, because usually that feels like a little bit weird. But we know it. We have parts of ourselves that are the part that wants to eat the junk food at night, the part that wants to get up early, and like we're constantly wrestling. And then in his methodology, we have self. So capital S, self, is like that internal guiding. It was sort of there before we were born. If you believe that, it will be there after we die. It's sort of the soul, the essence, the parent, like the internal parent or guidance. And so the idea is that some of these parts can get a little bit off the rails, right? So imagine he uses the analogy of like a symphony, right? If you're the conductor, that's self, and you've got all of these instruments, and you've got one instrument that's just playing insanely loud and the other ones are not, and they're just it's overpowering or for whatever reason, it's not going to sound as good. And so instead of just like kicking that guy or girl or whoever out of the band, you actually teach them to play at a level that can integrate with the rest. And the reason I bring this up is because there's a lot of people subscribing to this model of that part of me has to die, or I can't ever have this again, and or shaming a part, or having shame about a way of being. Again, with curiosity and compassion, we actually understand that every part, including the part of you that used to sit and watch TV and eat food, was doing that for a reason. So if we can get curious about what was the reason, then we can guide the effort to be more in alignment with the whole being versus out of alignment. So we actually, in his philosophy, we never get rid of parts. We just sort of step into our own leadership a little bit more, and also honor that like those parts were set up to help us self-soothe. So the other piece is we need to have some sort of capacity to cope, particularly if we're going to like remove a part or change a part or ask a part to change. We need to be willing to get curious about where our stress lives in our body. Why are we eating at that time? Like what's going on with that? And then how do we create the conditions where change just feels inevitable versus like that friction and kind of dissociation a little bit. That's how I'm currently thinking about it. And that's been a real big turning point for my work with clients, because nearly everybody, if not 100% of the people I work with, particularly around weight or health or whatever, they have deep-seated shame, whether they're aware of it or not, around what they should have done or did do or didn't do. And nobody gets better through shame. Like it just doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I love that part of you. I think that part is just doing something else now, maybe to self-soothe. Or maybe it is dead. We don't know.
No, it's definitely not dead. It's
Okay,
something.
perfect.
Yeah, no, I've talked about that part of me in therapy and like why it exists. That need to sort of have. It's more really about. I've kind of figured out that it's more about the time, like having that time
Yeah.
just to myself, and like the activity is really just,
Yes.
it can be anything. And for me, I've kind of flipped it and made it the 5 a.m. thing. Like that's my sort of time to myself where it's just me and my thoughts and things like that, rather than, so I've kind of just flipped it and, like you're saying, used it in a different way to get rid of. Yeah, it's good. It's one of those things, like there are a lot of things that I've discovered in my life that were like negative behaviors that I didn't need to isolate and get rid of, although I thought I would have to isolate and get rid of them. But eventually I figured out, it's like, no, I can just kind of take this from here and like a sticky note, just move it up to this part of my life, and it can be useful up here where it was detrimental down here.
Absolutely. There's a really good, I think it's The Healthy Deviant is a book by Pilar Gerasimo. She's pretty cool, but she's got like a clock that she uses with clients. And in her work, it's more like, it's usually they're talking about like, when did your energy go off the rails in the day? Or when did you start to like eat that food that you know that you don't really want to eat? And it's really like tracing back the steps of your day. So like, what needs did you forsake? Did you not get a good sleep, but then just ask yourself to kind of like grind through the day? Did you, are you a parent and you're just thrown into everybody's day with all of their needs and you haven't thought about yourself until 3 p.m.? You're going to have some friction and you're going to start doing things that are, like you say, right? Yeah, exactly. And I've been there. Like, I get that. So again, always recognizing that there's like a purpose to every behavior and then kind of walking backwards in time and going, okay, so at 3 o'clock every day, I'm just like, I'm looking for chocolate, or I'm looking for this, or I'm looking for that, or I'm just like really like grumpy or whatever it is. Then look back. And I love that you're preloading your day, Josh. Like you're setting up. So like you're saying, I'm actually first, which is like a big declaration. I'm first. What I need is first. My thoughts, it will never work perfectly, but you're claiming that, which is a really powerful thing to do. And then that's where you get like in personal development, we like the 5 a.m. club. And like a lot of people that are very successful wake up early and they do a bunch of stuff before anybody else is even awake. But like part of that too is that like they don't have to wrestle with themselves later on in the day so much because they've already set the tone for the rest of their day, which is really powerful to do. Those are my best days when I'm up at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
And I'm doing, like something meditative, something for movement, have a cup of coffee with nobody asking me to do anything. Like it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. I've actually started doing the 5 a.m. thing for the past couple months, and it's really changed a lot of things for me. I use it a bit differently. I don't do the meditative piece, which maybe would be a better use of the time. What I do when I was using my nights to stay up late, and I would stay up till midnight to work and get things done. What I've started to do now is I go to bed at 9:30 and I write down the things that that normally I would have stayed up till midnight to do. And I start them off at 5 a.m. So I get up. Once I'm awake, I do some of those things, and then I go work out at 6:30 to kind of start my day off that way. I don't know if it's the right thing, but it seems to be working for me right now.
I mean, I think the question is like, does that feel good? Does that feel like you're making progress? Because progress is really what we're going after, right?
Right.
We've talked about it. Corey, you and I have talked about it. And there's almost, again, like the high percentage of people in like the self-help, self-development world that are struggling. They might be looking like they're achieving really well, but they have that kind of deep emptiness inside. And it's that tendency for perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
So like perfection is the enemy of good enough. We need to be good enough and making progress. If you're a little bit better than yesterday and you feel good about that, celebrate the shit out of that. Like that is what's going to move your life forward. It's not the monumental, I did this. We're at the end of January. Most people's resolutions have failed at this point for various reasons. Mechanically, we don't understand how behavior design works. We just don't. We're not taught that, which is fine. Right. Mm-hmm. And also we make these big lofty goals, these big lofty promises, many of us. And it kind of just becomes like a bit of a joke. But like what's true is that making incremental gains is hard because it doesn't release as much dopamine. It's not as like, like, woo, look at me. But like that's the stuff that adds up and makes a big difference. So the
Awesome.
question to you, Corey, is like, does your morning feel like you're making progress? And if yes, beautiful. And if no, then you just tweak it, right?
It does, and I think the reason it feels like progress is because I'm actually getting sleep,
Yeah.
right?
Oh gosh. Yeah.
For
Yeah.
years I wasn't.
Yeah.
That's the main difference. Like I feel better because I'm getting sleep. I'm
Yeah.
getting 8 hours
And
sleep,
this is,
you know.
yeah. And this is the difference between like entrepreneurs now versus entrepreneurs 10, 20 years ago at most. But like this idea that like we're going to stay up all night and we're going to work hard, play hard. And like the less sleep I get, the more like the greater I am. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like we had that really, really wrong.
Mhm.
And it's challenging. I'm an entrepreneur. My husband and I have been various businesses for many, many years. And it's hard to put a cap to the end of your day, right? Because you're the one that people call if I have a daycare. The kids may or may not have thrown multiple toys down the toilet and broke a toilet. We get those calls at, whatever time. And so sometimes we can be in control of that, but it's really enticing for somebody to burn the candle at both ends as we speak, especially
Mhm.
entrepreneurs. We also are like often like a class of people that are a little neurodivergent, ADD, ADHD, somewhere on that spectrum, which is beautiful. But that typically means that like we like to almost create problems before, or like that intensity, right?
Mhm.
And are typically not as good at taking care of ourselves. So sleep is huge. It's absolutely huge. We need that. It's big. Well done.
Yeah, I've started to learn a lot about ADHD, just haven't gone through it, and not really knowing that I ever had it, and then discovering that I had it, and I've been able to, now that I know it, I've been able to kind of figure out how to use it more to my advantage versus it being a real detriment. And that's something that like was a huge change, but it was not a huge change that I could make very quickly. And I think I've noticed, like, as I've gotten older, I've become more patient with change. But when I was young, I wanted things to change by like lunch. Like I wanted to wake up and I was like, I'd like to make this change, please, and like have it done by lunch. But now I realize that like the big changes have to present as little changes. And I look back in my life and like some of the biggest things I ever did, like one of the biggest things I did was quit smoking. But it took me 8 months of planning to actually execute quitting smoking. Um, but like so many people I know who still smoke at our age, they want to quit, but they're like, oh, I should be able to quit right now. Why can't I? But there's not there. It's weird. I don't know if it's the society we live in, the fact, like you talked about dopamine, we all need those hits instantly, or we live in the society where everything is just kind of immediate, like that immediate gratification. But you're right. Big changes take time. They don't present. It's all a bunch of little changes that make the big one eventually.
Yeah, and those can feel really painful, and particularly to a brain that lives on that spectrum. We'll say ADD, ADHD. I also have ADHD, or not ADHD, I'm certain, but ADD. And so I know like the deep shame that comes from like having what feels like, so I've heard it described before, like people that have ADHD or ADD, it's like they have the engine, the internal engine, the drive of like a sports car, but like a motor sometimes of like a, well, I don't know, clunky old car or whatever, right? So like we actually have to take in different fuel to kind of get things in order. But there's this frustration of like wanting to go fast, but like needing to slow down enough to get piece by piece and moving forward. And the thing like, so one of the coaching certifications I did a few years ago that was super interesting was through the Amen clinics. The Amen clinics actually look at brain scanning. So, we talked about mental health a few times in this conversation. The psychiatrists, psychologists, people that are working with people in mental health are one of the few professions or specialties that don't actually look at the organ that they're treating. And the organ that is, in view in mental health is the brain. So Amen and Amen Clinics, Dr. Daniel Amen and Amen Clinics actually physically look at the brain. And what we know is that if somebody has ADHD, the part of their brain that has lowered energy is at the front. So prefrontal cortex, it's like that's where our brake is. So that's what stops us from doing impulsive things. That's where our executive functioning is, our planning. And so when we have to like be less impulsive or plan a bunch of things or like write an essay, like I remember like the intense, like just like I have these ideas, but like getting them onto the page and like that feeling of being stifled. What we know after like looking at brains is that when people that don't have those conditions need to focus, that part of the brain lights up. But when people that have some of those neurodivergent qualities, that part actually shuts down more. So, and then you get the back of your brain, the limbic brain, so that emotional part, the part that like really actually has a low frustration tolerance, for example. The harder we try, the more this shuts down. So it feels like it's working against us because it is. And so that's where I get real curious and excited about the brain body connection in terms of performance, but just like overall experience in life, is because there's stuff going on under the hood that when we understand it and we can like use it to our advantage, I think ADHD is a superpower. It's really, there's very few entrepreneurs, I think, that wouldn't fall into that category. Like you kind of have to be wired a different way. And that's beautiful. But if you don't know that you're wired that way and you start to kind of try to insert yourself in a traditional society, you're going to feel really different. And then you will, especially when you're little, like in a school system, for example, you will assert that you feel different because you are wrong. But you just feel different because you are different. And actually out there is a little bit mixed up. Like I've got a pretty busy 4-year-old, and at daycare, they're outside for up to 3 hours on a good, beautiful day. He'll go into kindergarten where there's more structure. I don't know. I think they might get an hour, hour and a half. So like 50% of their outdoor time, their nature time, their movement. And, people that have ADHD, they need that movement. Like they need it like a drug, because it is a drug in a great way for everybody. But like your brain's not even awake until, you get moving. And so my little guy will struggle when he goes to school, and I will coach him through that. But a lot of kids will just start to internalize, like, there's something wrong with me. I don't fit in this model, versus like, this model's kind of broken,
Right.
So that's the real trouble with being diagnosed when you're older too. I wasn't diagnosed until I was like 20. I'd already dropped out of high school. I was brilliant at many things. Like people with ADHD are like brilliant when the house is burning down, but like try to make the fire plan. No, thank you. Right. Like, and so you need to be able to delegate the things that you're not as well equipped at. You need to understand that your brain needs high levels of nutrition, needs more sleep than normal. It's a really active brain that needs a lot of really good nutrition. So lots of protein, lots of healthy fats, movement, sunlight, all of the things that everybody else needs, but like we just need it more. So we just get to take it more when we're entrepreneurs because we have so much free time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you've kind of just said, it hits home for me, because that was my struggle in school. Like people would tell my parents, like, he's really smart, he just doesn't apply himself, or he can't focus. And those were all struggles that I was having, because I was basically, when you talked earlier about being in a box, classroom was literally a box, that I was put in, where I wasn't given, I guess, the nutrition that I needed. It's the most successful person I've ever met and ever known. I don't think he's been diagnosed, but I'm fairly certain he has ADHD. He's got a very similar personality to me. But when we were kids in school, he had like these major struggles in school, just, single digits on math tests. Like those were some of his marks and stuff like that. I won't get specific more than that. But like he came out of school and got into the world of business, and he had a superpower, and he's become incredibly successful. And I always joked that he'll be a billionaire one day, and I'm fairly confident that he will. But like he's been able to utilize that. It just took him forever to figure out where to actually plug it in. And it's like, oh, this is the thing that's gonna, give me that sort of that, I guess, advantage over everybody else. But oh man, it was, as a kid, it was very frustrating, because I just always felt like, what's wrong with me that's not wrong with everybody else? And I didn't really figure it out till I was like 39 years old, basically.
Yeah, and that's wild. And I think what's tragic is that there's a lot of people that actually never figure it out, or they don't figure it out to the degree. Like we're talking about one small piece of like mental health and brain performance. We're talking about ADHD, but there's so many things like anxiety and there's so many pieces that people struggle with, and they don't have a real sense of like where that originates and whether that, and again, that's where I kind of step back with people and I look at the body, right? Like what nutrients are missing, what macronutrients are missing. Is there a trauma history? Are they moving? Are they sleeping? Are they getting all of those things to kind of, I was saying this to Corey at one point, but like I always think about like performance or like success as like a combination lock, right? So if you think about your health, for example, you need to have a certain amount of things in a row kind of clicked in at the right time to actually get that lock to open. The lock being like you're feeling great. If you're sleeping well, but like your mental health is terrible and you're, eating well sometimes, but like not moving very much, it's not until you get those kind of lined up all at once, working well enough that you can kind of unlock people's potential. And that's what gets really interesting is that there's a ton of ways we can do that, but there's a lot of people that are never going to really tap into that. And to me, that's the most tragic thing. And that's where that's my origin story. There's two pieces I'll say to that. One is like I grew up needing for my own sense of kind of safety and stability, I really needed my parents to be more tapped into like their full potential, but they didn't have the skills or the awareness or whatever. It is what it is. And they were great people, brilliant people. My mom was, she had 4 kids. We are all like 11 months apart. I don't know how she did that. And she went through nursing school. Like she was, I'm sure also had ADD. It's very genetic. It runs in families. But she was able of doing so many things. And she was this like bright, beautiful soul. And she died at 49 years old. She overdosed on fentanyl. She had been battling and battling and battling and never found a way out of that dark room that people live in, of like, yeah, just struggling within their own neurochemistry and struggling within their own kind of community of supports and struggling with like just not being able to apply themselves. And to me, that is so tragic, obviously on a personal level for me, but collectively, like there is nothing more healing than a person, that's healed. Meaning like when we heal as individuals, the healing occurs collectively in our families and our systems around. And when we look at the world, this goes back to the whole 51-20-51. Like we have very little hope of moving the needle on how we're doing collectively if we individually are still struggling. And so we need to have like a deep understanding of how to move from theory into practice and mastering our lives so that we can, close that gap, right? For ourselves, for our own like joy and pride, but like also because that's what's going to change the world, which is huge. And so I saw people that couldn't grasp that. And I knew they were good people. It had nothing to do with them wanting to be better or like being a good person or a smart person. It was not a moral failing, but there were other pieces that were missing. And so my life for the last, 20 years has been trying to pick up some of those pieces. So A, I don't do the same things as they do because I very likely could. And B, so that I can help others to like shine a light on like, maybe this is something that could help you, right? If you're willing to kind of listen to that. The other quick piece that I want to speak to is like, in terms of capacity versus performance, I think capacity is almost always there. It varies person to person to a point, right? But no, Josh, you talked about struggling in school and not knowing till you're 39. Like that is like a painful thing to sit with. I dropped out of school when I was in grade 11, so 16, 17. My capacity was always the same, but my inner capacity, but my results were very different. And it wasn't until I actually went back to school as an adult. So same person, same intellect, same genetics. I'm drop out of high school. I had tried to do online university or online college. That is not what people with ADD should be doing. That is not the methodology, the modality. But I found my groove in school a few years back, and I completed nursing school with running businesses, with a bunch of kids, with still lots of baggage from my, previous life, as growing up or whatever, with this learning challenge. And I had straight A's in nursing school and I was the same person. So if I had bought into the story of like who I thought I could be, high school dropout, young mom, single mom, All of the labels that I could have put on myself, I was all of those things, but in addition to that, I was also able to do all these other things. And when I was most successful is when I was dialing in those other pieces, when I was running and weightlifting and meditating and surrounding myself by people that were up-leveling their lives and by consuming content that fed me. And I never did any of that perfectly, but man, did I create some pretty fun momentum. And that's a good place to be. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sarah, I think that's probably a good note to start wrapping this up, unless there's anything else that you wanted to touch on.
I don't know. We talked about a lot. I feel like I talked a lot. But whatever.
You're the guest.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, sure.
That's good.
Is there anything else? Is there anything else that you guys want to talk about?
Well, the last question I would have for you is, when people tune in and watch this episode, what do you hope that they'll take from it?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I hope that they love your podcast and they add to your subscribers.
Thank you.
Hit subscribe wherever it is on the button. Yeah, you're welcome. I hope that something in my story or even one little piece of information lands for them and it sort of spreads a seed of possibility for them to take that next step, to push into something that maybe felt uncomfortable, but like something they knew they wanted. And I think more than anything, I really want people to understand that like community, like growth is going to happen in community. So do the work you need to do, but exponentialize it by being around awesome people and having these really powerful conversations, and you will move forward at a much faster pace. Yeah.
I love that.
I love that too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Amazing. That's actually been what this podcast has been about for us. That's the whole reason we started it, was to meet people outside of our little bubble and find people like you that have something to say and something that we can take and glean off and grow from. So thank you.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I think it's like today's the day to write your second story. You can do that any day you wake up. Call it your second, third, fourth, whatever. Write a new story because you can. You're still here. If you're still here, you can still write a new story, which is beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you have anything you want to plug?
Oh my gosh, so many things I could plug. Yeah, well, I've talked about Heroic a lot, so they probably owe me lots of money. I'm just kidding. What do I want to plug? So the question is like, how do people work with me? How do people connect with me? I'm still kind of on like a referral basis. I'm always a little bit in school and a little bit an entrepreneur. So I'm like, I have pockets of time where I work with people. The one thing I am really excited about, I was hired as a trainer and an instructor with Heroic. So I've now done international speaking and I've done facilitation training, and we've now trained well over 100 new instructors to do their workshops. So I deliver those workshops in like corporate settings or schools or private groups. So that's really fun. So people can connect with me just via my email, and you guys can leave that to kind of get more information about that. And the workshop model is really cool because it's like a good dive into like some really powerful content in an immersive way, but in that community space, which is really, really great. So I'm doing that. And then I'm working with people one-to-one. And I mean, if you live locally, I know you guys have listeners everywhere, but if you live locally, I do a book club once a month at the Bookkeeper in Sarnia, Ontario, which is so fun. And we talk about personal development books, and I create a space where people can come and not feel like they're going to be pulled out of the bucket into the bucket by their people around them. They can try on some new ideas. So that's kind of what I'm up to for now. Thanks for the question. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks so much.
We appreciate it.
That was awesome.
Take care, you guys.
So thanks again for tuning in to Second Story. Flip the script, write your sequel. See you on the next one.